Welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Arab Muslim Women Poets from Early Islam to Rabia, Ulayya, Wallada, and others, featuring Professor Wessam Elmeligi, an assistant professor of language, culture, and the arts at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. This is a Zoom webinar. It will last about an hour plus, and I'd like to mention that folks will have a chance to ask questions, during and at the end. There's a Q&A option. If you're on a laptop, if you move your cursor, you should see it at the bottom. If you're on a smartphone, you may have to look for the three dots, the ellipsis, the three dots, and maybe there you will see the option for the Q&A. I'd like to take this opportunity to, first of all, welcome you all. This is an event organized by the Muslim Studies program at Michigan State University. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Arabic Studies program at Michigan State, Asian Studies Center, Center for Gender in Global Context, Department of History, Department of Religious Studies, and James Madison College. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, and that is Professor Wessam Elmeligi. Professor Elmeligi is assistant professor at the Department of Language, Culture, and the Arts, and director of the Comparative Literature Certificate and the Arabic Translation Certificate at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. And by the way, it was not intentional to schedule this Michigan State University of Michigan event a few days before the Michigan State University of Michigan football game. With a PhD in literary theory, his research interests cover Arabic and comparative literature, translation, as well as Arab cinema and art. His book, The Poetry of Arab Women from the Pre-Islamic Age to Andalusia, is a critical anthology of more than 200 Arab women poets, most of whom are translated and discussed for the first time in English. His recent book, Cultural Identity in Arabic Novels of Immigration, A Poetics of Return, examines Arabic narratives, about West and East encounters from the 12th to the 21st centuries, representing Arab countries including Egypt, Lebanon, Sudan, and Yemen. He also wrote and illustrated two graphic novels, Why and Why, and Jamila. And when I met Professor Elmeligi last spring, and he mentioned what his research is on, I said, we have to invite you to give a talk for us. So, and I'm delighted he accepted. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Elmeligi. And again, for those joining, feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Professor Khalil. It's really a privilege to join you. And I'm, like we were speaking earlier, I'm grateful for webinars and for the ability to join you. I mean, it makes it a lot easier. And I remember when I met you at the museum, the Arab American Museum, last year. I mean, I was thrilled to hear the events that you were hosting, and I went over and introduced myself to and talked to you, and it was such a pleasure, and I'm privileged and honored to join you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think I can get started, and I'm sharing the screen, but I think I can start the presentation. And let me first start by saying what I will be talking about. So I'll be talking about Arab Muslim women poets, particularly from the period of what is referred to as early Islam to Andalusia, which is in a sense covering from around the 6th century or the 600s, sorry, to approximately 1200s. So we're talking about medieval times, and I'll speak about a number of aspects of why I studied and what we are going to cover. One of them is the reason I started writing this book, and I talked about it, and we will talk about that more in detail, is that there are several stereotypes about women in this period of time, in this part of the world in particular. And when I did some research at the time, I found that in comparable cultures at the same time, like for instance, women writing in Latin, I found almost a dozen or even less, and in other languages as well. Well, I found at least 200 women and possibly more writing poetry in Arabic, which is, it should say something about the culture itself. If women who are generally stereotyped as being victimized and being marginalized by a particular culture have written so much poetry. It does not say, of course, necessarily that they were given all the rights, but it definitely changes, or at least questions some of the, or challenges some of the stereotypes about women and their contribution to culture at the time. Especially the fact that those that the poetry that they have written has survived and has been anthologized over centuries and over the decades while they were writing and afterwards as well, which shows an interest and in the writing and the fact that it was valued. And as we are going to look at some details, the way I would like to approach this is through three different perspectives. The first one is slightly brief, and it's more out of just to showcase what is going on here. I did some kind of a digital analysis of the poetry of women during this period, and I'm going to talk about that in detail in a few minutes. And then we will look at in some detail at some of the poems thematically, and we would talk about some of the strategies that poets have used, and I try to group them through a specific type of analysis that is more thematic than anything else. And then I will talk a little bit also about some of the translation challenges that I've faced while translating some of the poems. So the idea here is not really to discuss the Arabic component, but just to show how the mistranslations can contribute to some of the stereotypes about Arab women poets of the time. And then finally, I will talk about the impact of the poetry of those women or those poets in other forms of culture, in cultural production in general, such as in visual arts, for instance, or even in contemporary social media, and how this has inspired me personally as well. Okay, so let's get started. I'll start by this is the title of the book that I've used for most of the items that I'll be discussing in the presentation. The first analysis, the first perspective, is a digital textual analysis. And I've used, for those of you who might be interested, a program or a software called Viant Word Map. Word mapping is, for those who have, I'm sure some people have used it, but some have not. And generally, the way I did that, I wasn't aware of it until I actually found this website discussing it with some colleagues. What happens is I would write the poem in Arabic, and this was, as far as I know, one of the very few, if not the only one at the time, as a word map that uses Arabic or that accepts Arabic. So I would write the poem, and then I would do some kind of analysis that shows what are the most prominent words that have been repeated. And this gave me an idea, or I used it with some poems, with some sample poems, to show the development of the ideas and the themes, and also the structure, but particularly the themes. What would be some of the most prominent words, and how did that change from pre-Islamic times to early Islamic times to Umayyad to Abbasid and Andalusian? And at this point, we will need to refer to the different eras that we will be talking about. Well, the focus is from early Islamic to Andalusian. I would need to talk briefly about pre-Islamic times just to contextualize the discussion here. So in what is referred to generally as pre-Islamic times, and this is sometimes considered a controversial term because there are different studies that argue, such as starting as early as Hussein, and that argue whether some of the poetry that is deemed or considered pre-Islamic is actually pre-Islamic, and it's possible that has been written later on. While I do not get into this argument now, I just thought I would mention it. But for the purpose of this study, I'm referring to those poems as pre-Islamic according to the most common anthologies that consider them pre-Islamic. One of the poets, for instance, her name is Safiya bint Sa'laba. And just to give you an example, this is what happens when we are doing this kind of study. So the words that we have over here are different words that have been repeated or that have some importance over here. If you look at some of them, I'll translate them. You don't have to be Arabic speakers. So one of the words is the word dignity, another is regret, another is destiny. And here you would have the word in blue is a focal word, and there are other words related to it. So the word in blue here is dignity. And words related to patience, astonishment, and so on. This points to, it makes sense because at the time, dignity and pride in particular were very important themes in Arabic poetry for poems written by men and also poems written by women. And we even have a genre in Arabic poetry at the time called pride poetry, Sha'ar al-Fakhr. So in a sense, this makes sense for the poetry written at the time. But as we move on, we are going to Al-Da'ja is another, Al-Da'ja bint Wahb is another pre-Islamic poet. Just let's look at some of the words that she uses a lot over here. Words such as diligence, care, fear, captivity. And here we start getting an important aspect about pre-Islamic poetry written by women. Most of it, or most of the poems were elegies. Most of the poems were written by women mourning the death of a male warrior or a male family member who died in a war or in skirmishes or in fighting between tribes. The word we have over here is weariness. That's the one in blue. And other words are captivity, depressed, and so on. So one thing I noticed looking at those examples, and there are others, of course, is that the focus of the role of women writing poetry in pre-Islamic times was specifically to write about men, to write, to mourn the death of men, or to talk about the pride that is brought to their tribe or the family because of the great deeds or works or heroic deeds of a male family member. So in a sense, the role of women was more somehow revolved around, at least as poets, revolved around the death or the achievements of men. The second category I referred to as crossover, which is for poets who lived before Islam and in the early period of Islam. So during the first four caliphs. And the iconic poet, probably one of the most famous women poets of the classical period is Al-Khansa. And this green word, what we have over here is Sakhr, and it's the name of her brother. And most of her poetry has been written, that she wrote was written about her brother who died in war. She's lost several several family members in war, and she would write some of the most beautiful elegies written probably in any language, but definitely in Arabic. The thing here is, it was said that Al-Khansa, when she wrote some of her mourning, some people during the early Islamic period objected to her poetry because they felt that this could be deemed as some kind of objection to God's decision or objection to fate, because she is, in a sense, objecting to death as well. But reputably, I mean, some anecdotes or some stories say that Prophet Muhammad himself told those who are criticizing her to let her be, and that everyone has something to weep about. And the same attitude or approach was upheld by Abu Bakr and Umar after him. At least this is how some of the stories go about how important Al-Khansa was. So we can see already some respect for her, that even if some of her writing is deemed slightly objectionable, she was still respected and allowed to continue writing. So we are noticing here a cultural prominence or a cultural importance for her poetry, for poetry written by women, but still the main theme is elegies, or focusing on death and focusing on a male family member. Again, the focus of the words over here are I cry, I weep, war, and so on. Now, after that, we move on to Umayyad, which is Umayyad, Abbasid, and Andalusian are largely considered like the golden age of Arabic poetry. I mean, sometimes they're referred to as the golden age of of Islamic culture in general, but I'm focusing on the poetry aspect. And certainly for poetry, for Arabic poetry, I would agree with that. One poet is Maysoon bint Bahdal. I mean, there's an argument whether she was Muslim or Christian, actually, but I mean, as an example, she's very important to look at over here. Notice the word in blue. This is a focal word that we have, is I love. It's a major movement from, or a departure from talking about death to talking about what she loves. And it's I love. So there is also a focus on the self over here. Other words related to I love are the things that she says she loves. So she loves things like bread, people, and so on. So the focus is clearly changing. And then an example from the Abbasid period is Ulayya bint al-Mahdi, who is one of the poets that we will discuss later on as well. And for Ulayya, we have the word love itself, which I'm not the one who chooses how to make the words bigger, but if the word is so emphatic over here, it means it has been repeated a lot, or it's very central in the poem. And for her, when she talks about love, she talks about things such as different types of love, actually. So with love, she says lover, she says easy, name, and so on. So everything related, or a lot of words that are related to the concept of love. So there is a conceptualization over here of love as a value itself. Again, the development is becoming clearer. With Andalusian poetry, we have another example. And this is for a poem, a study of Aisha bint Ahmad al-Qurtubiyya from Qurtuba or Cordoba. And the words that we have for her are, I am satisfied, or I satisfy myself with, or I'm satisfied by. So there is a movement from very emotional interpretation of love to something that is actually more about satisfaction. It is not even something that is related to someone, because love also is related to a partner. But here there is an aspect of her being satisfied. So we notice more and more agency as we make progress, or as we move on forward to from Umayyad to Abbasid and here to Andalusian. Another key poet that we will discuss later is Wallada bint al-Mustakfi. She's also an important Andalusian poet. And the words that she used over here have the word pride. But the thing that is very noticeable is that there is I repeated a lot. I am good for, I woke, I let, or allow. And the word that is repeated, or the central word here connected to everything else, is the word I. So again, agency is, and she's one of the latest poets that we discuss in that study. So again, the agency is very clear over here. So this is just an example of the kind of study that I found very revealing of how the contribution and the position of women poets changed during that period of time. Okay, this is as far as the digital textual analysis or the word mapping is concerned. And now to less dry analysis, and this is a literary analysis. I'll be looking at some of the poems. And the way I looked at this, or the way I categorize them, again, of course, there are numerous ways people can look at poetry, but I felt that the poetry written by women at the time can be considered some kind of a reclamation. So they are reclaiming something that has been denied to them. I even refer to it sometimes as a poetry of rejection. So they're rejecting what is imposed on them. So they're reclaiming a number of things. One thing they are reclaiming here is space. So when we say reclaiming space, we're looking at the Umayyad poet Maysoon bint Bahdal. We will discuss her more in detail later on, but I'll explain the poem here. And then when we talk about the translation, we'll get back to her. Let me look, actually I'll read the poem and then we refer to it later on also. So the story of Maysoon is that she was married to Muawiyah, who is a very important caliph and very powerful, an Umayyad caliph. And some of the anecdotes say that she decided to ask for divorce, and she left Muawiyah, which, according to stereotypes of women at the time, this would have been very difficult. And actually, in many other incidents, possibly in other places as well, it would not be easy for a queen in medieval times to ask for a divorce from a king. And not only did she get a divorce, but she actually wrote a poem describing why she wanted to leave and ridiculing court life or royal life, and ridiculing what people would understand to be the caliph himself. So she is comparing her life, which is much simpler before marriage, and the life of the royal court, and saying that she prefers to go back to her simpler life. She says, "A house throbbing with people is more pleasing to me than a lavish palace. A dog that barks to drive wanderers away from me is more pleasing to me than a tame cat. Wearing a cloak and being content is more pleasing to me than wearing sheer clothes. Eating a small crumb in a corner in my home is more pleasing to me than eating a loaf. The sound of the wind in every pass is more pleasing to me than the strumming tambourines. A difficult calf that follows the howdahs. Howdahs are like structures that normally put on camels, where princesses and rich women in particular, but also rich men will probably ride in. It's like some kind of a caravan. A difficult calf that follows the howdahs is more pleasing to me than a fast mule. Among my cousins, a weak and slender-built one is more pleasing to me than an overfed ass. We can probably guess that the overfed ass is a reference to her husband or to the king or the caliph. And again, the howdahs is the royal thing, and she prefers a little calf that will probably be following, running after the howdah itself. My rough life among the Bedouins is sweeter to me than soft living. For all I want is my homeland instead. Suffice it to say for me that it is a land of honor. And there is a clear reference over here to the fact that court life is not honorable. That's big. I mean, this is definitely poetry of rejection. This is someone who is critiquing royalty, and at an early time, and this would have been unthinkable from our perspective when we think of that time. But here we are, we have the poem, and the poem survived, and she herself survived at the time. Another example of claiming space. So she's claiming space. The space over here is the court or her hometown or her house. Another claiming of space over here is by Andalusian poet, and she's one of the poets that we will talk about in some detail. Her name is Hafsa bint al-Hajj al-Raquniya. And she is an important Andalusian poet, and she is known for her love story with Abu Ja'far ibn Ahmad, who was also a poet. Now, Abu Ja'far wrote about an encounter that he had with Hafsa. Apparently, they met in a scenic place, and it's a lover's meeting, and he remembers it. The way he remembers it is very fond. He's very fond of what happened, and this is part of his poem. The translation here is not mine. The translation by the women poets is mine, but this one is not. So he remembers it very fondly as a beautiful time. God ever guard the memory of that fair night from censure free, which hid to lovers, you and me, deep in Mu'ammal's poplar grove, and as the happy hours we spent, the gently wafted a sweet scent. From flowering Nejd, all redolent, with the rare fragrance of the clove, high in the trees a turtle dove sang rapturously of our love, and bells of basil swayed above a gently murmuring rivulet. The meadow quivered with delight, beholding such a joyous sight, the interclasp of bodies white, and breasts that touched and lips that met. So, he's obviously thinking of lovemaking. He's also thinking of romanticizing the entire place. So he's looking at this from a very as a fond memory. Look at how she remembers it. he remembers this as something very different. And it apparently, historically, it turns out that she is correct. She felt that they were being watched and they were watched by enemies. Later on, after that poem, he was assassinated because he was a politician as well. I mean, he's a poet, but he was very much interested. He was too close to the court. There was some kind of, there were conspiracies, and he died. So she apparently was more aware, well, probably more aware of her surroundings than he was. But she claimed that she disagreed with him, and she was writing something very different from what he says. So what she's saying over here: do not suppose it please Adele. This is also not my translation, by the way, that we should there together dwell in happy union, choose to tell. It showed us doubt but pretty spite. The river did not clap, I fear, for pleasure that we are so near. The dove raised not his song of cheer, save for his personal delight. Think not such noble thoughts as you are worthy of, for if you do, you'll very quickly find and rue. High thinking is not always wise. I scarce suppose that yonder sky displayed its wealth of stars on high, for any reason but to spy on our romance with jealous eyes. A very different recollection and a very different interpretation and a very different understanding of what was going on. And as far as the accounts of what happened, she knew better, or she was aware of what was going on, and he was not. That's an important comparison. So I'm trying to do some kind of comparisons between pre-Islamic poetry and Islamic, and also between poetry by women and by men. The second type of reclaiming over here, thematically at least, is reclaiming the body, or how women reclaim their bodies in their poetry during that time. The next poem is not very pleasant. It's by an Umayyad poet called Shaqra bint al-Hubab. And the story goes, or the anecdote of the context of this poem is that she was probably in love with someone, and she was in a forced marriage. This is one explanation. And her husband, called Amr, found out, and he was whipping her, or he started beating her. And she teases him. And look at what she writes. I tell Amr as the whip circles around my body. Lashes are the most wicked proof it's true. So bear witness, you who is jealous, that I love him. Flog me, but the one who is humiliated is you. So her body becomes an instrument for torture. He thinks he is actually hurting her, but the more he hurts her, it's only proof that he is being humiliated. So her body, which is being weak over here and apparently defenseless, is actually more powerful than his. And she is the one who's causing him pain, which is a very interesting perspective. The exact details of the relationship, I mean, there are different poems that she has written. And I think the other person that she's referring to is called Yahya. But this particular poem is very interesting in that respect, as a tool of empowerment. Another poem by an Umayyad poet, Ad-Dahna bint Mishal, and this is during a divorce case from another Umayyad poet, Al-Ajjaj. And it said that she was publicly asking for divorce. So she went to a judge. And again, that in itself is also an element of, in a sense, a degree of empowerment, that she's asking for the divorce and she's getting it. And when she did this, he tried to show, one explanation is that she probably accused him of impotence, or she was saying that he was impotent, and that marriage is not consummated, and therefore she wants a divorce. And he tried to kiss her or hold her in front of the judge, but she pushed him away and she said, "Move away from me. You cannot have me with kissing, embracing, or scent." This particular poem will become important later on in a less scandalous context, because it shows agency of who has a control of a woman's body, and we can see over here that she has a control of or agency of herself pretty clearly. The next poet that we will be looking at is an Andalusian poet, and her name is Aisha al-Qurtubiya, and I mentioned her earlier. This is a beautiful poem, and she's using a metaphor of lioness, and a lioness, I think in many cultures, including Arabic, feline, female felines like lioness, kitten, they are used usually in a derogatory sense when describing women in different respects. But she is using that in a very different way. She's using it as a metaphor of empowerment and not a metaphor of shame or a metaphor that would belittle her. So words like lioness or kitten or cougar and so on have been used particularly for objectification or to portray women sexually, but she's using it in a different way. She's saying, I'm a lioness, but for the life of me to become someone's mount, I shall never allow myself. And if so I ever choose to be, a cur I would not count when to lions my ears were deaf. Now the context of this poem is even more interesting. This was a poem that she wrote in response to someone proposing to her. So she is saying, I'm a lioness, and if I've said no to lions, why would I say yes to a dog or a cur? I mean, not exactly the kind of response probably the person who proposed expected. We do not know exactly who that person is, but the poem shows that she did not respect him. It's possible that he proposed in a certain manner, but we do know that it's a proposal, and this is her response to him. Now we come to the Andalusian poet Wallada bint al-Mustakfi, who is a very interesting poet, and she has actually been subject of some studies as well. She is not as well known as other poets such as Rabia or Khansa, but she really warrants a lot of attention. Now, she would write, or what the poems we're looking over here is that she would actually sew or embroider her clothes with poems. So on the right side, she would write something, and on the other, she would write something else. So the entire poem would be weaved and would be part of what she's wearing. This is one of her most beautiful poems, an iconic one. On the right side, she would say, by God, I'm fit for the highest of peaks, and I walk my walk and boast in pride. On the left, she would write, I enable my lover to have my cheeks, and if someone craves a kiss, I provide. It's a naughty poem that she, I mean, very sort of, in a sense, playful. And the fact that she is writing it is warding off anyone who would think of her in a different context. And this was important, particularly at the time, because what we are looking at over here is when Andalusia was at its height, but also soon afterwards, Andalusia starts to collapse. Women were becoming more and more, at least the women poets that we see over here, were claiming more agency, and part of that agency was agency over their bodies and of what they control and who they want to have a relationship with and who they would allow into their personal space. Wallada has become an important poet, because I mean this is playful, but she has also been important politically as well, and we are going to look at that later on. The next type of reclaiming is reclaiming the mind. So we have talked about reclaiming space, reclaiming the body, and now we're going to look at how those wonderful poets reclaim the mind in their poetry. We are starting with an Abbasid poet, Taqiyya bint Ghais al-Ashuriya. This poem and the next one, and those are just two examples, are related to wine. And it's just as by way of context over here, there is an entire genre of Arabic poetry at the time called khamriyat, or wine poetry. So there were poems written in Arabic celebrating wine, and some of the best poems written were by someone called Abu Nawas, but there were many others, and particularly Abbasid poetry was when most of this poetry was written. Some of it was written in pre-Islamic times as well, but the Abbasids in particular excelled at it. So what we see over here is a woman rejecting wine, and the really interesting aspect of it is that she is not rejecting it for religious reasons. She's rejecting it also, or at least we don't know also not, but she's rejecting it particularly, although she does mention a religious aspect, but she's rejecting it for logical reasons for her, that she feels that she does not want anything to impair her ability to make decisions. So she says, there is nothing good in wine, though mentioned as a feature of paradise, because it's mentioned in Islamic tradition as a feature of paradise. For it blends with the sane. For if it blends with the sane, madness would bring his demise. He'd fear a downfall so steep, leaving the heart with no guise. So, I mean, everything will be uncovered, and she doesn't want that. It's mentioned as a feature of paradise, but she doesn't want it here, which is very interesting. Again, the focus on mental health and the focus on the fact that she wants her mind to be powerful. Another poet who writes about wine, again condemning it, is al-Ala al-Hijriya. And she, actually, this one is really interesting because she likes wine, but at the same time, she decides to not drink or drink less, we don't know, but her reason is very interesting. She says, if only wine did not disagree with longing and singing so, among wine cups you'd find me, making all my wishes grow. Now, her reason is that it would disagree with singing and longing. Many, and this would bring another important point, that many of the women poets at the time were also singers, some were even performers, including wives and even sisters and family members of caliphs and kings who would put their poems to music and sometimes would even sing them as well. So this is really interesting that she's looking at her creative faculties or her creative abilities being negatively impacted by drinking wine. And she would rather be able to sing and to write poetry than to drink wine. So she has a taste for it, she likes it, but she will not use it because she wants to write and she wants to sing. The next type of reclaiming is reclaiming the narrative. And when I say reclaiming narrative, I mean reclaiming how a story or how their story is being told, not allowing anyone else to tell the story instead of them. And here we come to one of the iconic stories of Arabic poetry at the time, which is that of Qais and Layla. And Qais and Layla are the Romeo and Juliet of Arabic literature. They actually were, I mean, their poetry and their story was before Romeo and Juliet. So they are the iconic Arabic story of the impossible love, or the star-crossed, or the doomed lovers who were in love and eventually did not end up together, and they both died at the end. And it's better known in some circles and in some translations as Majnoon Layla, or Layla's madman. Because the story says that Qais, who is a male poet, was madly in love with Layla, and actually did eventually lose his mind, according to, again, quote unquote, because of his love for her, and he died. Now, Qais is a very famous poet. He's one of the most established Arab poets. The story is true, or at least part of it. There was a very tragic love story, and the poetry is true, and those poets actually lived. But Qais is way better known as a poet than Layla. She is mainly known as the object of his poetry. He writes life poems to her, poems of longing, and the type of poems you would expect from this kind of a love story. What we have over here is Layla herself writing a poem about the love. Layla al-Amiriya. The madman suffered nothing that I as well had not felt. But he told the secret of love while I in silence would melt. Now, if you look at this, what happens over here is one of the reasons for their plight is that Qais would write poems about them, and parts of the poems that he would write would show that he had met her, and that maybe even he had intimate knowledge of her, and these would bring them even more trouble. So she's blaming him for, in a modern sense, talking too much. In addition to this, he was allowed to talk about their love, but she was doubly punished in a sense, I mean, socially at least. One was that she was deprived of him, and two was that she could not talk as much as he does. And she's challenging that. She's challenging the narrative that he is a madman, that he's the one who's only one who suffered, which is really interesting that her poetry or poem over here is criticizing him as well. She's not just criticizing society or the community, or the culture itself. She's criticizing the lover, the male lover, and who, in a sense, hijacks the narrative. So she's saying the madman, referring to him, suffered nothing that I as well had not felt. I suffered as much as he did as far as love is concerned, or the deprived love is concerned. But in addition to this, he told the secret of love. At least he could speak. While I, in silence, would melt, while I was not allowed to speak in a male-dominated society that she suffered from. And the next poet is also an Umayyad poet, Aisha al-Baghdadiyya, and she was not a free person. She was a slave girl, and she was gifted to Abdullah ibn Tahrir. He's a high-ranking officer of al-Ma'mun, of a caliph. This is a painful poem, and she was silent, and she would not speak, to the extent, according to the story or the anecdote, the historical account of this. They even thought, the men and the people who knew her, they thought that she could not speak, until eventually she broke her silence and she talked in disdain, and she said those lines. Silence of two alternatives is the one with favored consequence for me. And for me, it is better than an utterance of dispute. Do I brandish a weapon among those who do not know it, or do I sprinkle pearls among the blind in the dark? In other words, what I say would have no impact on you. You wouldn't care about what I'm saying anyway. It's like sprinkling pearls in the dark among people who will not be able to see the pearls. There is a very important element over here of how she values her ideas and what she says, and that her words are so precious that she wouldn't share them, and her story is so precious that she wouldn't share it with people who would not value it. The last line in particular is beautiful. Do I sprinkle pearls among the blind in the dark? Next is an Abbasid poet. Here we come to Ulayya bint al-Mahdi, and one of the reasons she's an important poet is that she is the sister of Harun al-Rashid, not because she needs to be related to a man, but because Harun al-Rashid is himself very important as far as literature is concerned. He's one of the very few political figures of the time to become so iconic and legendary that he is cited in literary and even mythological and legendary writings and films afterwards. He has become an example of extravagance. Some of that is not true, or has become an example of wealth. And he is somehow, some people would consider him, he's one of the figures that are used in Orientalist writing of or portrayal of this period. The idea of the belly dancers, the idea of the extravagance and the money thrown away, the harem, and so on. Many of them build that around an image of Harun al-Rashid, and there are TV shows and films everywhere that use that, but there are other historical accounts that show him to be in many ways different from those accounts. I mean, some of them are true and some are not. And that's why being his sister is important, because it's also part of the image about them. Harun al-Rashid also, I mean, just to give you an example, is one of two, I think, historical figures that are mentioned in the Arabian Nights. I mean, the Arabian Nights is a fantastical narrative of genies and of demonic creatures and of different kinds of supernatural creatures and characters. It's a beautiful narrative. But Harun al-Rashid is an actual historical figure, and he's part of that. Just to show you how attractive he is, and his entire entourage or his entire court has been, and therefore the entire culture around him in a literary sense. So his sister here is writing a ghazal poem. Ghazal is Arabic for courtship, or for poems of not really love, but it's poems written usually about an object of love or a love interest. And there were two types in Arabic. Some of them is, one type is called implicit ghazal, and the other is explicit. We're looking at the more implicit ones. I don't want to talk about the explicit sort of such so openly, but I mean, if you research those, you'll find some poems that can be a little bit embarrassing. I would recommend you read them on your own and not in front of a lot of people. This is just an example of that, but there's a play word over here that's really interesting. The heart for ripe is yearnful. Oh Lord, how is that shameful? Now, ripe is a name that she has used more than once, referring to someone that she's writing about. We don't know who that person is. It's probably, and it was very common at the time to use names like pseudonyms for a love interest so that nobody would know, especially someone in her social status. Some people are saying ripe could be, actually she could be playing with the word Ya Rab, which means oh God. So it's like referring to him as God send, or like maybe a prayer that you would like to see him. Someone would say that she's playing with the word Zainab, maybe as some kind of like religious or spiritual reference. We don't know, but yeah, the most common interpretation as a tribe was someone that she was in love with, possibly someone in the court or in the palace, and that's why she is hiding his identity. The heart of Ribe is, for Ribe is yearnful, oh Lord, how is that shameful? So again, she's challenging, why is it shameful to be in love with someone? There will be more references, there will be another reference probably to Ulayya later on. Now, the next couple of poets are also very interesting. This is an Abbasid poem. Her name, her name is Ainan. And to understand what is going on, we are looking at the context of Majlis al-Majinun. Majlis is a committee or council. Majinun is like the lewd ones or the very playful ones. This was particularly, it was actually, they were not really, intentionally lewd, but the idea over here is that this was a literary salon, probably one of the earliest in Arabic literature at the time. And the idea was many of the very well-established poets would meet at the house of one of the poets, and they would compete in writing poetry. And some of the most beautiful poems ever written in Arabic were produced in some of those majalis or some of those literary salons. Abu Nawas, and he is considered like one of the greatest also. I know I'm using superlatives all the time, but this, we just mentioned earlier that this is a golden age. So you will find an greatest, iconic, stuff like that used a lot. So Abu Nawas is a very important poet at the time, and he has written a variety of poetry, and his poetry has been studied over the ages. Some of his poetry is wine poetry. Some of his poetry is particularly later on is spiritual poetry. In the middle, he has written poetry that is slightly politicized. Some of his poetry might be considered is considered also erotic. Some of his poetry is considered very literary in the sense of literary innovation. He has established some of the desert, what is referred to sometimes as desert poetry, and reinvented it. So he's a very important poet with a lot of themes that are very different from each other. So, I mean, he expected to have the majlis in his place. So Ainan was one of the female poets in the majlis, and she challenged him, and she said, "Why not have this in my house, the literary salon?" So they decided that everyone is going to spontaneously, and that's a very important principle over here, impromptu poetry, improvised poetry that does not take a lot of time to write. And a lot of poets at the time, we are talking about an age where many people were writing poetry, or at least the poets were so well achieved and established that they were in circles. So the agreement here was to improvise poems, and the people of the majlis, or the members of this council, would decide whose poem is better, and that would be the person to host the literary salon next time. So she wrote this: "Wait, slow down, for Ainan is a better decision and well-deserved. At your place, the best delicacies and the tastiest food is served. For beverages forbidden and allowed in my position shall be. Seek no one else on earth than as far as eyes can see. Is my verdict true or not? Be honest now for the life of me." The poem was apparently so well received that the literary salon was held in her place afterwards, or at least this is how the anecdote goes. So this just is an example of how women poets were held comparable, considered comparable and competitive with some of the best poets of the age writing in Arabic. Let's get back to the Andalusian poem we mentioned earlier, Hafsa bint al-Hajj al-Rakuniyya. Remember, she was the poet who was in love with another poet called Ja'far, and he was the one who wrote a poem recollecting their time together, saying how beautiful it was and how nature was blessing them. But she wrote a very contradictory memory of it, or account of it, saying that actually those who were watching us were conspiring against us, and it turned out she was correct. This is the same poet. So she would leave love notes and even visiting notes for Ja'far, which is really interesting, because what we are having over here is she goes to him, and she, again, part of the agency is that she would leave him a note. So she would leave impromptu a couple of lines with a messenger to tell him that she was looking for him. This is an example of some of those short, very short poems. A visitor has come with a gazelle neck, yearning to the crescent under the wings of darkness. What do you say of letting the gazelle in? Or maybe it is interrupting some business. We said earlier he was busy and he was a politician, so she's sending him a message. It's pretty much like texting, but in Andalusia in the like 1,000 years ago or something. Again, here she is taking the initiative of calling on a lover, possibly Ahmad ibn Abdul Nabi. We don't know if it's the same person or not, but some people say it's a different one. Do I visit you or do you visit me? For my heart leans to what yours desire. Again, those are short lines, and they also show they're in Arabic. They're in a much lighter rhythm as well, but they are meant to be very musical. Here I need to introduce a concept, or at least, sorry, I mean, a lot of people would know this, to talk about them, the concept of ijaza, which, let me try to sum it up quickly. It's a tradition of writing, which is when one poet would begin a couple of lines in a poem, and then another poet would finish those using the same rhyme scheme, the same rhythm, and would pretty much finish or complete the poem. So one poet would set the rhyme and the rhythm. The challenge is the other would finish the poem in their own words, but also trying as much as possible to follow the same rhyme scheme, the same rhythm. So there are plenty of examples of that. Some of them are really beautiful. Some are very funny. So Abu Nawas once ran into Ainan. Those are the two poets we mentioned earlier in the literary salon. So Ainan she was in the street and Abu Nawas saw her, and he recited the following lines. With its new daisies each day, the earth loves as the sky is weeping. She finished his poetry with the following lines. Like a bride on a wedding day with a dress from Sana'a that the merchants are weaving. Sana'a is a city in Yemen. We're having a question. I can answer that now. Some of the stories about these poems, I'm skeptical of the attribution. Do we know that these are likely written by their purported authors? Yeah, but that's why I keep saying anecdote or story was. It's not. Some of the stories are not easy to confirm. Some of them have been written in collections of poetry that were compiled after or during the lives of those poets. So I would agree with you that some of those stories are probably true, but some of them I would take with a grain of salt. But the poems themselves have survived for a long time. Some of the context might be true. I mean, because some of the poets, because the poems, the writers themselves definitely existed and have been studied for a long time. The relationships, many of them are correct and have been established. The exact details, some of them might be true, some of them are not. It's not easy to confirm. But the idea, the fact that they existed, and the fact that they were written at all, whether whether accurately or not, I'm using that to explain, or at least to show how women were perceived, women poets were perceived culturally at the time, which is in a sense the point of this study. But I agree with you that not all of them I would take as history, but I mean a lot of things in history, particularly literary history, need to be sort of revised, or are not always very sure. I'm not sure why I'm not. This is not moving. Yeah. Another important poet is Fadl. She's Abbasid as well. And that's just another example of the challenge. Abdullah al-Qasim is a poet who challenged Fadl, and he said, they said you loved a young one. I told them the most delicious ride is one not mounted before. Such a difference there is between a pierced pearl and that which was never pierced afore. I mean, there is very clear derogatory intention here. Fadl replied using the same meter and rhyme scheme. A ride is not a joy to mount unless tamed and mounted before, and pearls are of no use to their owners unless they have been pierced and threaded afore. He's probably referring to, or he's trying to insinuate that she has had lovers before, and she's responding to that using the same meter. Of course, in Arabic, I mean, in translation over here, I try to use the same or similar, or at least close enough rhyme scheme to show the musicality. But of course, and we'll talk about translation in a few minutes. I mean, the beauty of the original is also in the meter as well, not just the rhyme scheme. The last type of reclaiming, and this will end this particular part of the study before we move on to a couple of other points, is reclaiming the soul. And Rabia is, and Fatima al-Zahra are among the most important. Fatima al-Zahra, this is a poem attributed to her as well. Again, the attribution, I mean, some people say it is true and some might disagree with that. She wrote this after the death of her father, Prophet Muhammad, and she says, I wish death had found me before it found you. I would not have mourned you then, and the book or the messages, depending on how you translate it, would not have come between us. The reclamation over here spiritually is she's reclaiming her right to mourn and her right even to think of this as something that she would have wished would have happened to her. So there is an aspect of referring to the soul as something that goes above and beyond, away from the book, could be reference to Quran, or the messages, like messages between her and him. But there is a very strong reference over here, at least metaphorically, to a meeting of souls and spirits. Now we come to Rabia al-Adawiyya, who is one of the really important pioneers of Sufism. Some people would even say that it's possible that she is responsible for Sufi poetry, or at least one of the pioneers of Sufi poetry. And this is one of my favorite poems of her. Notice how she writes the poem as if it's a love poem. So unless you know that she is actually writing about God, or she's writing a spiritual poem, you might think she's writing to a lover. I love you two loves, a love of love, and a love because that is what you deserve. As for the love of love, it keeps me away from anyone but you. As for that which you deserve, it is that you removed all veils till I saw you. There is no gratitude due to me for either this or that, but all gratitude goes to you for this and for that. So she's putting both body and soul together. She loves two loves. She has this duality in her writing. And the two loves over here are also two spheres of love. The regular love, the love that she would love, her object of love. Here it is a reference to God, because he deserves it. But then there's another love that is something else, because he removed all the veils between her and the deity, or between the sublime. And this has made her see him with the heart, with the eye of her heart, in a sense. And she says that she has no gratitude. I mean, she wouldn't thank herself for any of this, but it is all him. It's a beautiful poem, and in Arabic, we're going to listen to a singing rendition of it in a few minutes. There's another poem where it's clear over here how she talks about the soul as separate from the body. I put you in my heart to speak to me, and left my body to whomever sits with me. Thus it can have the company of my body, while the love of my heart would keep my heart company. So she thinks of her lover in this sense, again, as a spiritual poet. She was thinking of God in her heart, so her body would be with people around her. They can have that, her physical presence, but her heart, what she has in her heart is for her only. So again, the separation between the spirit or the soul or the mind or something that is untouchable or something that is intangible, immaterial. And that's a very higher level of reclaiming over here. For the critical translation, I will go through this quickly because I know we are running out of time. The idea of critical translation here is not just to translate, but also to go over translation, published translation of some of the established texts and critique those. And of course, my critique is just mine. People can disagree with that. I was looking at the challenges of different methods of translating poetry, which is sometimes considered among the most difficult texts to translate. I think I might have had something or like quote over here. Among all the forms of translations, and translation of poetry is held to be the most difficult, demanding, and rewarding form of translation. This is written by David Connolly, one of the theorists of translation. There are different levels of translation, whether it's literal, so you're translating with the level of words, or communicative, you're actually trying to communicate the meaning. And there are different methods of translating poetry. You can translate it into prose, so you're just explaining what happened. I mean, no music whatsoever, especially if the original is musical. It distorts the sense, but it just delivers a message. You can have a rhyme translation, which can be, if you overdo it, can become some kind of double bondage in a sense of you're trying to pedantically produce some kind of rhyme. And this can actually come at the expense of the meaning. Blank verse, which means you try to give a sense of internal music or a sense of balance, but it's not really musical. The last type is interpretation, which is you just explain what the poem's about, but it's not really much of a poem. I tried to make a decision using some of those. Again, for the interest of time, I will not go into a lot of details, but just a couple of important aspects or important terms I would like to use over here, just to explain the point of stereotyping through mistranslation, is domestication and foreignization. Domestication in translation means when a literary text is translated in a way that makes it sound as if it is written in the target language. So I'm translating from Arabic into English. So I use certain expressions to make this sound English. Sometimes this can be overdone and it sounds as if this was actually an English text written by an English poet. And I would add to it in a sense that can distort the original. The opposite strategy of translation is foreignization, which is the opposite. So I want to showcase, or I want to prove that this is a poem that was written by a different language from a different culture. And sometimes they even add certain words that are not in the original, and to make sure that everybody knows that this is foreign. It's a bit like exoticization, so it makes it sound even more exotic. And this also can be problematic if it's used in a certain way. Now, what I'm looking at here, I will have to skip the Arabic quickly. Remember that translation, the poem by Maysoon bint Bahdal, who was married to the Caliph and who wrote saying that she prefers her life, which is much simpler than living in the palace or living in the court. There are some translations that I critique over here. Like, for instance, I'll look at just some of them. The Rasit suit of camel's hair with spirits light and eye serene. One of the things I'm commenting over, I'm critiquing over here is the word camel's hair. There's no mention of camel at all in the original Arabic. And again, the use of a camel over here is an example of Orientalism, maybe, or an example of exotic or trying to foreignization. Like this is coming from Bedouins, coming from the desert, and therefore the camel is mentioned over here. Let me go over. Yeah, take these purple robes away. The color, the purple color is sometimes used, not necessarily in Arabic culture, as a royal color. I mean, the mention of purple is not in the original as well. So this could be maybe an example of domesticization, like adding something that would be perceived by those who are reading in English that this is royal. Purple robes. Those are just a few examples. Let me move on from this and go quickly through the last part of the talk. This is reimagining Arabian poems, intermedial analysis. By intermedial, I'm using it here meaning like other media, such as art, different types of art, like such as visual arts, for instance, cinema or painting or singing, and how those women poets were used over there. I'll start with painting and illustration. This is a beautiful selection, or like a show. I'll go through them quickly, of Majnun Layla. Remember Layla's story, the love story between Layla and Qais. And it is an illustration of a poem written about Qais wa Layla. It's called Khamsa, 5. It's 5 poems by Nizami Ganjavis. He's a Persian poet of the 12th century. They were illuminated in Persian miniatures in small paintings by 15th century. They were done for illuminated later on 15th century Emperor Akbar. Some people would say about Fridausi. Look at the drawings over here. As Professor Khair was saying, I'm also a graphic novelist and artist, and I like seeing these because for me they represent a type of graphic novel. So this is supposed to be the story of Qais and Layla, possibly over here from the relationship earlier on. And there are different aspects of the story of like wars and tribes over there. And let me move on. Part of that is when Qais, it is said that Qais was sent to a pilgrimage with the hope of forgetting about Layla, but that did not happen. Again, this is also one anecdote of that. When Qais had to leave because he was rejected and he goes away to, again, this is the imagination of the artist over here. He went to the desert and he meets, according to the poem by Ganjavi, he meets people along the road and he exchanges, he gives them everything he has. And we have an interesting interpretation of Qais over here, that he becomes what we refer to sometimes in literary traditions as a noble savage. So he becomes, he lives with animals and the animals befriend him. And this is where the part where his mental health starts deteriorating, at least according to the story. And it's said that he sees Layla afterwards and he doesn't even recognize her. He is found later on, and at the end, this is the last painting where it says that when finally he and Layla are allowed to meet again, they both faint because, I mean, they could not believe that they could see each other. And then the final drawing that we have over here is possibly of the death of Qais. Again, those are only interpretations, and you can still use them. Now, in more modern times, we have songs of inspired by the stories. Like this is one of my favorites, Ahmed Shawqi, the Egyptian 20th century poet, wrote an operetta called Majnun Layla. And it was sung by Syrian, I mean, later on it was adapted into for singing by Asmahan, the Syrian singer, and Abdul Wahab, the Egyptian singer and composer. This is Asmahan and Abdul Wahab. We can listen to just a couple of seconds from it. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to listen to this. If not, then maybe I think it's the voice is not working for some reason. Well, I mean, we're running out of time anyway, so let me move on to just more examples. Again, there was a duet also about Layla by Wadia Safi, the Lebanese singer, and Ruba Al-Jamal. Maybe when we, if we post this on YouTube or something, we can use and then there's a film, and this one is one of my favorites. Not the film as such, but also the fact that it works with Rabia al-Adawiya in different ways. There's more than one film adaptation of Rabia's story. Shahidat al-Hubb al-Ilahi, the Martyr of Divine Love, in the 1960s, an Egyptian film. And then a better known version was just Rabia in 1963, actually very soon afterwards. And this one starred Nabila Obeid, but the interesting part about it is that she portrayed here as a singer, which some anecdotes again say it was true. The singing was done by Kulthum, who is like the diva, or the one of the iconic, again, I'm using my exaggeration, but definitely she was an iconic Arab singer. And she sings, I wish we could play that. She sings a poem that I read, I Love You Two Loves, which is beautiful. This is Kulthum. Those are scenes from the film portraying Rabia. Interestingly, some of the film adaptations are probably as exotic as the translations. But it's interesting how this was portrayed. And this is Farid Shaw'i. He's supposed to be someone who, or like the master who captured, or at least in one anecdote, a slave owner, and Rabia was a slave, and he is transformed by hearing her poetry and her singing. Again, it's not working. We will have to. I can share that with everyone. There are there's more of that. Like, this is a very interesting television show, serial television, so Muluk al-Tawa'if, and in it we have other poets as well. If you remember at Tamad al-Ruqumiyya, we didn't mention her, but she's one of the important poets. And Wallada, finally, is a character in a TV show, which is also very interesting. I mean, the TV show is about Andalusia, or mentions Andalusia, and one of the main characters is Wallada bint al-Mustakfi. If you, just a reminder, she's a poet who would write on, or would weave the poems on her clothes. Again, according to the stories. And social media, I mean, you'll find different references. Just as an example, you would have like Facebook pages, and there's even this is really interesting, a high school called Wallada bint al-Mustakfi, Sanawiyat Wallada bint al-Mustakfi, Lil-Banat for girls. It says here, established 1986. I found this really interesting, so I just took a snapshot of it. I would like to end with some kind of personal inspiration, how this inspired me personally, and also just I mean, I can't resist talking about sort of some of the drawings. Those are 3 drawings I did. This is Qais and Layla. I'm imagining them as a Romeo and Juliet kind of couple in a sense. Also, actually, I prefer them to Romeo and Juliet in many ways. And this is the 2 lovers in their scenic place, and they're being watched. I mean, I didn't put anybody watching them because I decided to keep the painting interesting. And then finally, Wallada bint al-Mustakfi again, and her 2 poems written on her clothes, or even her clothes. Okay, I can stop here, and I will be happy to answer more questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Elmeligi. That was extremely interesting. And I know I learned a lot from that, and hopefully others did as well. I'd like to encourage folks to type in their questions in the Q&A. I know we said we would conclude at 8:45, but we'll continue for a few more, maybe until 8:50. Professor Elmeligi mentioned some YouTube clips. When we post the video on our YouTube page, the Michigan State University Muslim Studies Program YouTube page, we can list the links in the description. So yeah. Actually, I'd like to ask Professor Elmeligi to take this opportunity to tell us about your publications, your the books that where people can read more about these things.
Oh, thank you so much. The one book where I used mainly for this is The Poetry of Arab Women, from pre-Islamic age to Andalusia, and it's a translation of approximately almost 400 poems. I'm planning hopefully to do a second edition where I try to turn this into a reader, so I put the Arabic next to the English. This way it would be even better for those who are using this for translation purposes. The second book I have is actually more for modern, it's not, I mean, relevant to this one, but it's more for modern novels, as you mentioned. The drawings that you saw at the end are from two graphic novels that I did, and they were, like I said, inspired by those. I'm still working on the second, hopefully like a second volume, or maybe a second edition of the book, like I said, with the poetry, and maybe do some editing and add the Arabic as well.
Excellent, excellent. And let me actually, while we wait see if there are any questions, I'll ask some of my own questions, a couple of questions that came up to me. The first one is, we read in the sources about some women warriors in the first century of Islamic history, people like Khawla bint al-Azwar, Ghazala of the Khawarij, reciting poetry and also leading armies even. I wonder if this factors into your research and what your assessment is of these kinds of poems.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I mean, there's also a little bit of a change over here, but the tradition existed even in pre-Islamic times to a certain extent. The way it was earlier was mainly that the women would be reading the poetry to incite men who fight or to encourage them. But in the earlier Islamic sort of tradition, or with poetry, they were actually sometimes even involved in leading some battles, and they would be using poetry to also encourage their soldiers. So it's very interesting how the tradition remained, even if the role became more and more advanced. I would call it more progressive, even in a sense. Not that war is progressive, but the idea that of their contribution or participation.
Yes, absolutely. And I wonder also, of the poems and the poets you encountered, which stood out to you most? What was most inspiring or most surprising?
The most inspiring for me were Rabia. I know it's a classic answer, but the poetry is just beautiful. It's very spiritual, and I found that very touching. I was also, and you might have noticed this, very much inspired by Wallada, and she stood out to me. The agency that she has is amazing, and the fact that she's using also something visual, maybe because I consider myself a visual person, by writing her poems. I mean, again, like someone asked how much of this is true, the fact that she would write her poems or not, but the very fact that this was said about her is really interesting. Some of the things that also stood out for me is the idea of anthologizing, which I believe deserves more research. I mean, there are anthologies that were written about women poets as that early, like Al-Asfahani, Kitab al-Aghani, and there were others specifically for women poets in medieval times. So this is a very interesting point of research for those who are interested in pursuing more about this. Because this could also answer the question about the authenticity in many ways. Who actually recorded those poems, who kept them, and who anthologized them? This has been an important question for me. How come all these poems survived, and in what way?
Yes, and actually this question of authenticity reminds me of the discussions about the authenticity of hadiths, and one of the common responses is that even if you have a hadith that's not authentic, it does convey ideas that are circulating and values that are circulating. So that's helpful to keep in mind. So
exactly.
Excellent. Well, we are at 8:50. Oh, actually, we do have a question. So this will be we have a comment. Thank you for a very fascinating lecture. And this is from my colleague, Professor Leila Tarakshi.
Thank you so much.
Now, actually, we do have one final request, and that is, could you recite one of the poems in Arabic?
Do you have time for that? Or,
let's do it. Yes.
Okay. Sure. I'll have to look the poem up over here for. I will do that for Rabia, actually. I'll have to look it up.
And we also have here this comment. This was very insightful. Thank you from Samar. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, and Zahra also. I agree. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Lecture.
Thank you so much. I think I'm, yeah, I'll have the poem in just a second. Yeah, so I will read this one. It's the one that Rabia wrote saying, I love you two loves, the love of love. So I read that in Arabic. أحبك حبين حب الهوى وحبا لأنك أهل لذاك فأما الذي هو حب الهوى فشغلي بذكرك عمن سواك وأما الذي أنت أهل له فكشفك لي الحجب حتى أراك فلا الحمد في ذاك لي ولا ذاك لي ولكن الحمد لك في ذا وذاك. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Professor Elmeligi. That was
Thank you so
very
much.
Yeah, and we have another comment. No question. I just want to thank you. It was an interesting topic from Sumaya.
Thank you so much.
That's very good. Well, thank you so much, Professor Elmeligi. And for those of you who would like to see this again, we will post the recording on our YouTube page, hopefully, and they'll have the links for the recordings that were mentioned. And also, another comment here. Excellent webinar from Amina.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege and an honor to be with you, and I really thank you for this. And hopefully, I'll be able to follow more webinars that you hold as well.
Absolutely, yes, it'll be our pleasure. Well, thank you so much, Professor Elmeligi, and
thank you everyone who wrote a comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, the YouTube link. So if we don't have the link at the moment, but you know, we have the Michigan State University Muslim Studies Program YouTube page. Let me see if I can find that link here.
That'd be great.
And that's where it'll be posted. So let's see, Michigan State Muslim Studies Program. I'll just find our page here. Here we go. And I believe this link I'll post in the chat should, let's see, I'll type the answer in the Q&A here. And I'll also put it in the chat in case folks can see that. Yes, everyone. So I'll post here this in the chat as well. This should lead to the Muslim Studies Program, the channel page, and hopefully we'll post it there. So
thank you. And I will share with you, like we said earlier, the links to like the song and the things inside, so you can use those in the comments or something. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much again. And
thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks.